March 19, 2023. 11:45 p.m. 350 miles east of the Bermuda Triangle, Atlantic Ocean. Ship named the Seawolf. Captain James R. Miller. Total crew members 18. Destination Miami, Florida. Total estimated time to reach 10 days. The Atlantic Ocean stretched before the Seawolf, its dark, churning waters glowing faintly under a blanket of thick, rolling clouds. It was an uneventful night, the vast ocean seemingly endless, as the ship made its way toward Miami. The crew of 18 men and women went about their business, unaware that tonight, their routine journey would lead them into something far darker than they could ever have imagined. Captain James R. Miller, a seasoned officer with over 20 years of sailing experience, stood alone at the helm, the wind tugging at his jacket as the ship sliced through the waves. The Seawolf was a well-oiled machine, its engines humming steadily beneath the deck. The sea was calm, and the moon, though partially obscured by clouds, cast a faint light on the water, giving the night an eerie sense of peace. Miller glanced at the navigation system. The ship was in the middle of the Atlantic, far from the familiar shores of the East Coast. They had left the port of Charleston earlier in the day, and in just a few more days, they would be unloading their cargo in Miami. It was another routine trip, one that Miller had made countless times. But tonight, something felt off. There was an unease in the air that he couldn't quite shake. The radio crackled to life, its sharp hiss breaking the silence of the night. Miller turned toward it, instinctively reaching for the receiver. At first, there was only static, the kind of feedback that was common on long-range radio transmissions. But then, through the static, a faint voice emerged. The words were broken, urgent. "This is the Calypso. We are lost in the fog, something beneath us, it is watching. Please, do not come, turn back now. It is too late." The message ended abruptly, the voice cutting off mid-sentence, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. Miller's heart skipped a beat. The Calypso. He had heard the name before, the ship had been lost at sea decades ago. It was one of the infamous disappearances in the Bermuda Triangle, an event that had never been solved. But now, after all these years, why was the ship sending out a distress signal? And why was it so urgent? Miller's fingers tightened around the receiver, his mind racing. He turned to his first officer, Lieutenant Sarah Dunlop, who had been monitoring the radar. "Sarah," he said, his voice steady but with an edge of uncertainty. "Are we near the Bermuda Triangle?" Dunlop glanced at the screen, her brow furrowed. "We're within range, Captain," she said, her voice laced with disbelief. "We're about 350 miles east of it." "But Captain, this doesn't make sense. The Calypso went missing more than 30 years ago. There's no way that signal is real." Miller didn't reply right away. He knew Dunlop was right, there was no logical explanation for the signal. Yet, it had come through clearly, and something about it made his skin crawl. He had heard the stories, about ships that vanished, about strange occurrences that seemed to defy explanation, but he had always dismissed them. Until now. As the ship cut through the calm waters, Miller's unease grew. The ship's hum, which had been so steady before, now seemed to echo unnaturally through the steel frame of the ship. He glanced around the bridge. The lights flickered for a brief moment, then steadied, but the feeling in the air remained. Something was wrong. And then, it happened. The fog rolled in. At first, it was nothing more than a soft mist on the horizon, but it quickly thickened, moving faster than any fog Miller had ever seen. Within minutes, the Seawolf was completely surrounded. Visibility dropped to almost zero, and the once steady instruments on the ship began to flicker and sputter. "Sarah," Miller called out, his voice now tinged with urgency. "Get the radar back online, now." Dunlop scrambled to work the controls, but the radar remained useless. The instruments malfunctioned as the fog pressed in, making the ship feel as though it was trapped in an invisible prison. The sea itself seemed to have changed, growing still and ominous. Miller squinted into the darkness, trying to make sense of what was happening. But then, he saw it, a faint, glowing light in the distance, far below the surface of the water. He narrowed his eyes, trying to focus on the glow, but it quickly vanished as the ship shuddered violently, throwing him off balance. The Seawolf groaned as if it were alive, and the air grew heavier, thicker with each passing second. The crew scrambled to their stations, shouting orders to one another, but it was clear that something was happening beyond their understanding. Miller could feel it, the ship was no longer in control. It was as though some unseen force was guiding them, pulling them towards something. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the light disappeared. The fog remained, wrapping the ship in its suffocating grip. But what was that light beneath the water? And why did the Calypso send its message now, after so many years? What lay ahead in the depths of the Atlantic, waiting for the Seawolf? The questions hung in the air, unanswered. But the answers, Miller knew, were out there. If you want to uncover the terrifying truth behind these questions, make sure to like and subscribe. The Seawolf sailed through the Atlantic's vast, empty expanse, but the weight in the air was suffocating, as if something unseen was pressing down on them. The fog had arrived swiftly, almost without warning, swallowing the ship whole. Captain James R. Miller stood at the helm, his hands tight around the wheel as he stared into the dense fog that surrounded them like a living entity. It felt as though the ocean itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. There had been no storm, no warning of any kind. The sea had been calm, eerily calm, and the crew had gone about their duties like clockwork. But now, with the ship drifting in the unnatural stillness of the fog, Miller could sense the change. He could feel it deep in his bones. Something was wrong. He turned to Lieutenant Sarah Dunlop, standing at the radio controls. Her face was pale, her expression tight with concern. "Sarah, is the radar picking up anything?" Miller asked, his voice steady, though a tightness in his chest betrayed his anxiety. Dunlop's eyes were glued to the screen, her fingers tapping rapidly as she worked to adjust the settings. "Nothing, Captain. The radar is completely down. We're flying blind out here." Miller's grip on the wheel tightened as a cold shiver ran down his spine. The ship had been perfectly operational just hours before. But now, in the thick fog, nothing seemed right. Every warning light on the control panel flickered erratically, the low hum of the ship's engine sounding more like a growl than the soothing sound of a well-functioning vessel. And then, from somewhere deep within the fog, came a sound, a scraping noise. It was faint at first, so subtle that Miller thought his mind was playing tricks on him. But then it came again. A low, dragging sound, like metal scraping against stone. It seemed to be coming from below the ship. Miller's breath caught in his throat. "Sarah, do you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dunlop's eyes widened in horror. "I do," she said, her voice trembling. "What is that?" The scraping sound grew louder, more distinct, followed by a low, rhythmic thrum that vibrated through the entire ship. The fog, thick and suffocating, pressed in even harder, making the air feel dense and unbreathable. Miller's pulse quickened. He felt as though the ship was being pulled, not by the current, but by some unseen force below the water. Just then, the ship shuddered violently. It felt as though they had struck something. The lights flickered and then went out completely, plunging them into darkness. The entire ship groaned, as if something was dragging it through the water. The crew was thrown off balance, their panicked voices echoing through the ship's corridors. Miller fought to stay calm. His heart raced, his breath shallow. He shouted into the darkness, trying to make sense of it all. "Get the lights back on. Now." Lieutenant Dunlop scrambled to get the backup lights working, but it was clear they had no control. The Seawolf was drifting, pulled by an unseen force. The scraping sound continued, growing louder with every passing second. It was coming from beneath them, from the very ocean they sailed on. And then, just as quickly as the lights had gone out, they returned. But what they illuminated was far worse than the darkness. In the distance, faint and barely visible, was a soft, pulsating glow, shimmering just beneath the surface of the water. It was an unnatural light, unlike anything Miller had ever seen. His stomach tightened as he stared at it, the eerie glow throbbing with an almost hypnotic rhythm. "Captain, what is that?" Dunlop asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Miller swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had no answers. The light was unlike any reflection, any beacon, any signal they had seen. It was something far darker, far more dangerous. He felt a sense of foreboding deep within his chest. The ship was no longer just drifting. It was being drawn toward that light, pulled by something more than the ocean itself. The scraping sound grew louder, now accompanied by a low rumbling, like the growl of a beast lurking beneath the waves. The ship shuddered again, as if it were being caught in the grip of some unseen predator. Miller's eyes darted from the glowing light to the crew, their faces etched with fear, their eyes wide with disbelief. "Get everyone on deck," Miller ordered, his voice harsh and urgent. "We need to find out what is happening. Now." As the crew rushed to obey, Miller's gaze remained fixed on the glowing light beneath the water. What was it? And why did it seem to be calling them? But then, as if to answer his unspoken question, the ship gave another violent lurch. Miller stumbled, nearly falling to his knees as the entire ship seemed to groan, as if something from below was pulling it into the depths. The rumbling noise grew louder, and the scraping sound reached a deafening crescendo. It was no longer just a sound, it was a force, an energy that was pulling them toward the abyss. And as the crew stood frozen in terror, the ship was dragged deeper into the fog, closer to the unknown. What is that glowing light beneath the water? What is pulling the ship towards it? The Seawolf drifted deeper into the fog, its engine sputtering as the crew braced for whatever came next. The silence that enveloped them was suffocating, more oppressive than the thick mist that clung to every inch of the ship. Captain James R. Miller stood at the helm, his hands still gripping the wheel, but he felt no control over the vessel anymore. The ship had become a prisoner of the fog, trapped in a world where time and reason no longer seemed to exist. The scraping sound that had haunted them earlier had stopped, but the rumbling from beneath the ocean remained, deep and constant like the growl of something enormous, something hungry. Miller's eyes scanned the darkness, the unnatural stillness of the sea pressing down on him, making every breath harder to take. He could feel it, a presence, something in the water, something alive, something ancient. He turned to Lieutenant Sarah Dunlop, who stood beside him, her face pale and drawn. She was staring at the radar, her hands trembling as she attempted to make sense of the readings, but the instruments remained useless, giving nothing but erratic signals. The fog had completely swallowed them. There was no way out. "We need to do something, Captain," Dunlop said, her voice barely audible over the hum of the ship's failing engines. "This fog, it's unnatural. I don't think we're alone out here." Miller did not answer immediately. He was too focused on the swirling mist, too aware of how close they had come to the edge of something beyond their understanding. His mind was racing. The distress signal from the Calypso, the eerie glow beneath the water, and now the fog, it was as if they had sailed into a realm where the laws of nature no longer applied. Suddenly, the ship shuddered again, throwing Miller off balance. He grabbed the railing to steady himself, his heart racing. The ship had not hit anything, but it felt as if something had grabbed hold of it from beneath. The rumbling grew louder, and this time, it was accompanied by a deep, guttural noise that vibrated through the ship's hull. "Captain," Dunlop whispered, her voice filled with terror. "Do you hear that?" The growl from beneath them grew louder, and Miller's gut twisted with fear. This was no natural sea storm. This was something else. He leaned forward, peering into the fog, searching for any sign of what could be causing this. And then, through the dense mist, he saw it, just a flicker at first, a faint glow coming from beneath the ship's hull. It was pulsating, slowly at first, then growing stronger, brighter, until it was unmistakable. The eerie, unnatural light glowed through the fog, far below the surface, coming from something that should not exist. Miller's breath caught in his throat. That light, it wasn't a reflection. It was as though something was calling them from the depths of the ocean. He stared at it, frozen, his mind racing with questions. What was that light? Why was it pulling them toward it? As if on cue, the ship shuddered again, this time more violently, and the growling from below grew deafening. It was now more than just a sound, it was a force, vibrating through every inch of the Seawolf, as though something enormous and ancient was stirring beneath them, waking from a long slumber. Get the engines back online. Miller shouted, his voice urgent, shaking with panic. Full power, now. The crew rushed to their stations, but the fog pressed in, thickening around them like a living thing. They could not escape it. The ship seemed to be moving on its own, pulled by the unseen force beneath. The light beneath the water grew brighter, and with it, the growling sound intensified, now accompanied by the unmistakable scraping noise once again. Miller's mind raced. This was not a storm. This was not a freak accident. Something far darker was happening. Something ancient. And then, through the fog, they saw it, the figure. At first, it was just a shadow, a silhouette in the distance, but then it took shape, its outline growing clearer, until it was right there, in front of them. A humanoid figure, tall and pale, its body unnaturally elongated, its limbs stretching far too long. It moved in and out of the fog, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly intensity, like twin orbs of light. Dunlop gasped. What is that? Miller stared, unable to form words. He could feel the air around him grow colder, the fog thicker, suffocating him. The figure was moving toward them, gliding above the water like a phantom, its gaze locked on Miller. He could feel it, whatever it was alive. And it was not alone. The rumbling beneath them grew louder still, and Miller's mind was filled with questions. What was this creature? What was it doing here? And why was it coming toward them? The figure stopped just before the ship, its glowing eyes fixed on the crew. There was a long, terrifying moment of silence. The fog closed in tighter around them, swallowing the ship in its cold embrace. And then, the figure spoke, but it was not a voice they could hear with their ears. It was more like a thought, direct, sharp, and clear in their minds. You should not have come. Miller's heart raced. The fog thickened, and the figure slowly faded back into the mist, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. The crew stood frozen, staring into the darkness, their minds racing with fear and confusion. What is the figure? Why did it say they should not have come? To uncover these terrifying answers, make sure to like and subscribe. The truth lies just beneath the surface, and the horrors that await are only just beginning. The Seawolf continued its slow journey through the fog, the crew increasingly uneasy as the thick mist pressed in around them. Captain James R. Miller stood at the helm, gripping the wheel with both hands, trying to maintain some sense of control. The fog was unlike any he had ever encountered before, thick and suffocating, as though the very air around them was alive. The ship seemed to be drifting aimlessly, as if pulled by an unseen force. The calmness of the sea had vanished, replaced by a heavy, unnerving silence that hung over the ship like a shroud. Miller turned to Lieutenant Sarah Dunlop, who had been working tirelessly at the radar station. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she adjusted the dials, but the readings remained erratic and useless. The fog seemed to be blocking everything, rendering their instruments almost entirely blind. The unease in the air was palpable, every crew member feeling the same dread, the same sense of impending danger. Sarah looked up from the radar and met Miller's gaze. Her voice, usually confident and steady, was now laced with fear. I cannot get a clear reading, Captain. The radar is down. We cannot see anything in this fog. Miller nodded, his jaw tight. He knew this was more than just a malfunction. They had sailed this route countless times, but tonight was different. The strange distress signal from the Calypso, the eerie glow beneath the water, and now this fog, it was all part of something much bigger, something they could not yet comprehend. Suddenly, the Seawolf gave a violent lurch, as though it had been struck by something massive. The entire ship groaned, and the crew stumbled, thrown off balance by the sudden shock. The lights flickered, then went out entirely, plunging them into darkness. Miller's heart pounded in his chest as he fought to keep steady on his feet. Something was pulling them, something far beyond their control. "Get the backup lights on!" Miller shouted, his voice harsh, but there was no response from the crew. They were all too focused on the rumbling below, the low, unrelenting growl that seemed to shake the very foundation of the ship. The sound was coming from beneath, deep within the water. It was a vibration, like the growl of something massive, something ancient, stirring beneath them. The Seawolf was no longer sailing. It was drifting, helpless, being pulled toward an unknown force. Miller's eyes scanned the fog, trying to find any sign of the source of the rumbling. And then, through the mist, he saw it, just a flicker at first, a small, glowing light beneath the surface of the water. It pulsed, faintly at first, like a distant heartbeat, but then it grew brighter, stronger, and Miller could feel it in his chest, as though the light was pulling him in. It was like nothing he had ever seen before. It was unnatural. The growling from below grew louder, now joined by a high-pitched screeching noise that sounded like metal scraping against stone. The sound pierced the stillness of the night, its intensity making the ship shake. The crew, who had been standing still in stunned silence, now scrambled to find their footing, their eyes wide with fear. They were trapped. The Seawolf was at the mercy of whatever lay beneath them. "Captain, what is that?" Dunlop asked, her voice trembling with fear as she pointed toward the glowing light. Her hands shook as she tried to regain control of the radar, but it remained dead, useless. She was just as helpless as the rest of them. Miller swallowed hard, his mind racing, but there were no answers. "I do not know," he replied quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to be the one to reassure his crew, but there were no reassuring answers. Whatever this was, it was beyond them. The glow grew brighter, the rumbling intensifying. It was no longer just a sound. It was a force. The ship gave another violent jolt, this time so strong that it almost sent Miller crashing to the floor. The lights flickered again, then went out completely, plunging them into total darkness. The only light now came from the eerie glow beneath the surface of the water. And then, as if on cue, the fog parted just enough to reveal something else, something even more terrifying. A shape, large and moving toward them. It was no ship, no vessel they had ever seen before. It was sleek and metallic, glowing with an unnatural light. It moved effortlessly, silently, through the fog, like something that was never meant to be seen. The crew stood frozen, watching as it came closer, its glowing lights reflecting off the surface of the water. Miller's pulse quickened as the figure drew nearer. He could feel the ship being pulled toward it, helpless against its power. The fog around them shifted, almost as if it were responding to the craft. The ship shuddered again, and for a moment, Miller thought he could hear a voice, faint but distinct, as if coming from the craft itself. It was not a voice they could hear with their ears, but something deeper, something that went straight to the core of their beings. And then, the craft fired a beam of light, sharp and focused, hitting the Seawolf with the force of a thunderclap. The ship lurched violently, the hull groaning under the strain. Crew members screamed, stumbling as the light enveloped them, bathing the entire ship in a blinding, unnatural glow. The beam was not like any light they had ever seen. It was like a force, a pull, pressing them down. The ship seemed to bow under its weight. Just as suddenly as it had started, the beam disappeared, and the fog closed in again. The alien craft, now hovering above them, seemed to flicker in and out of existence, its lights dimming. The crew stood in stunned silence, their eyes wide with terror, trying to process what they had just witnessed. The ship was still, the rumbling from below fading into an eerie silence. But Miller knew this was far from over. Whatever had just happened was only a small part of something much larger, something that they were now caught in. What was the craft that appeared in the fog? What does it want from the Seawolf and its crew? The fog surrounding the Seawolf remained as thick as ever, pressing against the ship with a suffocating weight. Captain James R. Miller stood on the bridge, staring out into the void. The ocean was still, unbroken by waves, and the ship, having lost all power, drifted aimlessly. The crew had gathered below deck, their faces a mix of fear and confusion, as no one could explain what was happening. Miller's mind raced, but there were no answers. They were in the middle of the Atlantic, far from any land, and the radio was dead. They could not communicate with anyone outside. The fog had swallowed them whole, and the strange events of the night felt more like a nightmare than reality. As the ship drifted, Miller glanced at his first officer, Lieutenant Sarah Dunlop, who had been monitoring the instruments. The radar was still useless, and the compass spun wildly, giving no direction. The wind had picked up, but it was not the wind of a storm. It was a cold breeze, as though the fog itself was moving, pressing against the ship, guiding it. "Captain, the crew is getting anxious," Dunlop said quietly, not looking up from her screen. "They're asking if we have a plan." Miller clenched his jaw, frustration rising. He had no plan. They were stuck, and the longer they stayed in this fog, the more he felt the weight of it. He could sense that something was wrong, something far beyond what could be explained by weather or technology. Then, the ship shuddered once more, breaking Miller from his thoughts. This time, it was not from a strange force, but from the sheer weight of the fog pressing down on them. The ship's hull creaked as if it were being pulled. Miller's stomach twisted. There was something out there, something that was drawing them in, and he could not figure out what it was. He turned to Dunlop, his voice steady despite the uncertainty. "We need to get moving. Try to restart the engines. We cannot just sit here." Dunlop nodded, but before she could respond, a faint, distant shape emerged from the mist. At first, it was just a shadow, indistinguishable from the fog. But as it drew closer, the shape became clearer. It was a ship, no, not just any ship. It was a massive, dark silhouette that moved silently through the fog. Miller's eyes narrowed. He had never seen a ship like this before. It was not like any cargo vessel he had ever encountered. "Sarah, do you see that?" Miller asked, his voice low. Dunlop turned, squinting into the fog. She could see it now, a hulking shape, its edges sharp and angular, barely visible in the mist but unmistakably there. The ship moved without sound, its massive form gliding effortlessly through the water. It was not a ghost ship, but it had the eerie appearance of something ancient, something that did not belong in the world they knew. As the Seawolf drifted closer to the figure, Miller could feel his heart rate quicken. The ship was far too close, and the feeling of being watched intensified. The crew, now gathered on deck, stood still, staring at the approaching shape. There was no movement from the other ship, no sound of engines, no lights. It was as if it was waiting for them. Miller clenched his fists, trying to steady his breath. "Sarah, can you get a reading on that ship?" Dunlop was already at the radar, her fingers flying over the controls. "Nothing, Captain. The radar is still down. It's like it's not even there. No signals, no readings, nothing." The Seawolf was now close enough to see more details of the ship. The vessel was old, worn with age. Its hull was rusted, and its sails were tattered, hanging loosely as though they had not been used in years. But despite its appearance, it was moving with unnatural speed, gliding smoothly through the water without a sound. There were no lights, no crew in sight. It was a vessel that should not be there. Miller's gaze remained fixed on the ship. "Sarah, get the crew below deck. We cannot approach that ship." But as he turned to issue the order, something unexpected happened. The ship, the ghost ship, slowed, as if it had finally noticed them. The massive, rusted hull moved to the side of the Seawolf, stopping just short of their bow. Miller's heart raced. The crew stood silently, not daring to move. The air was thick with tension. For a moment, everything was still. The only sound was the wind, whistling softly through the rigging. And then, from within the mist, a low, groaning sound came from the other ship. It was a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very air around them, deep and resonant, like the groaning of a ship that had not been touched in centuries. Miller's instincts screamed at him to turn away, to pull the Seawolf back and get out of there. But the ship, like some ancient force of nature, had a hold on them. The crew waited in silence, eyes fixed on the ghost ship, as the ship remained unmoving beside them, a dark, hulking presence in the fog. The stillness of the moment felt like an eternity. Then, as if on cue, a single, solitary figure appeared on the deck of the ghost ship. The man was tall, dressed in old, weathered clothing that looked as though it had been worn for decades. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, and his hair long and matted. He stared at them, his gaze cold and unblinking, as if he had been waiting for them all along. Miller stepped forward, his voice firm. "Who are you?" He shouted across the water, but the man did not respond. He just stood there, staring, his presence sending a chill through the crew. The man raised his hand slowly, pointing directly at Miller, before disappearing back into the fog. The Seawolf was now silent, the tension almost unbearable. The crew exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what had just happened, unsure of who or what they had just seen. Why did the man on the ghost ship point at Miller? What is the true purpose of this mysterious ship that has appeared in the fog? To uncover these answers, make sure to like and subscribe. The truth lies just ahead, and the journey only grows darker from here. The Seawolf sat still in the thick fog, the ship's engines dead, leaving only the sound of the water lapping against the hull. Captain James R. Miller stood at the helm, staring into the haze that surrounded them. The fog had not lifted, and with it came a heavy, unsettling silence. The crew moved about the deck, their faces showing signs of weariness and confusion. They had lost all sense of direction, the ship caught in an unnatural stillness. Miller's mind raced. The strange glow from beneath the water, the mysterious distress signal from the Calypso, and the sudden appearance of the ghost ship, it was all too much to ignore. They had sailed into something they could not explain, and now they were stuck, trapped in the fog with no way of knowing what was coming next. Lieutenant Sarah Dunlop approached, her face grim. "Captain, I cannot get the radar back online. We are completely blind out here." Miller nodded, his gaze still fixed on the fog that enveloped them. He had hoped the fog would lift, that the ship would regain control, but nothing had changed. It was as if they were being held in place by some invisible force. "There has to be a way to get the engines working again," Miller said, his voice steady but his frustration growing. "Try everything. Get the crew working on anything that can restore power." Dunlop did not argue. She turned and relayed the orders to the rest of the crew. They scattered, moving quickly to try and restore some semblance of normalcy, but Miller knew it was futile. The ship was no longer just malfunctioning. There was something more to this, something that had brought them here. As the crew worked, Miller remained at the helm, his thoughts drifting back to the ghost ship that had appeared out of the mist. It was not a ship like any he had seen before. Its weathered, rusted hull had glimmered faintly in the mist, an eerie silhouette that felt out of place in the world they knew. The shape had moved toward them without sound, gliding through the water as if it did not need the usual force of an engine. Dunlop reappeared by his side, her expression tense. "Captain, the fog, it is moving in again. The ship is pulling us back toward that figure." Miller's eyes narrowed as he looked ahead. The ghost ship had disappeared into the mist, but its presence lingered, heavy and unsettling. There was something about it that was not just strange, it was wrong. The way it moved, the way it glided through the water without any sound, it did not belong in this world. Miller's grip tightened on the wheel as he fought to regain control of the ship, but the more he tried, the more the Seawolf seemed to be drawn toward the fog. "This is no ordinary ship," Miller said quietly, almost to himself. "There is something out there that is holding us here." Just as he spoke, the scraping noise returned. It was faint at first, but it grew steadily louder, coming from below the ship. The crew paused for a moment, listening to the sound that now seemed to be coming from every direction. It was not a mechanical sound, there was no machinery involved. It was more like a heavy, dragging motion, as if something enormous was moving beneath the hull, slowly and deliberately. "Get the crew below deck," Miller ordered, his voice sharp with urgency. "We need to move away from here." But before anyone could react, the ship gave a sudden lurch. The entire vessel groaned under the strain, and the lights flickered, casting the ship in an eerie, dim glow. The rumbling sound below grew louder, vibrating through the ship's frame, until it felt like the very ocean was shaking them apart. Miller turned to Dunlop, his face tight with worry. "What is happening?" Dunlop's face was pale, and she shook her head. "I do not know, Captain. The ship it is being pulled. Something below us is controlling it. We cannot stop it." Miller stared out into the fog, his mind racing. He could feel the ship being drawn, the unnatural force pulling them deeper into the mist. The crew worked frantically, trying to restart the engines, but it was no use. The ship was caught in something far beyond their understanding. And then, without warning, the fog parted. For a brief moment, Miller saw it clearly, the ghost ship, its massive, dark silhouette looming ahead. The rusted hull and tattered sails were still visible, but now the ship seemed closer, far too close. It was not just a ghostly image, it was real, tangible, and it was here, directly in front of them. Miller's heart sank as he realized the truth. The Seawolf had not just drifted into the fog. They had been led here. The ghost ship was part of something much bigger, something that had been waiting for them to arrive. The ship's lights flickered, and Miller quickly turned to the crew. "We need to get away from it. Now." The crew scrambled to follow his orders, but the ship was already in motion. It was no longer in their control. The Seawolf was being drawn toward the ghost ship, unable to break free. As the two vessels drew closer, Miller could see movement on the deck of the ghost ship. Figures, ghostly and translucent, appeared along the railings, watching them. Their eyes glowed faintly, and they stood still, unblinking, as if waiting for something. What is the connection between the ghost ship and the Seawolf? What is the purpose of the ghostly figures on the deck of the ship? The Seawolf remained locked in place, its engines useless and the crew working frantically to regain control. The ghost ship loomed ever closer, its massive, dark form cutting through the fog with a silent, unnerving presence. Captain James R. Miller stood at the helm, his hands tightly gripping the wheel, though he knew there was no point in trying to steer the ship. The fog was pulling them in, dragging them toward the ghost ship with an invisible force that no one could explain. The crew was scattered across the deck, their faces pale, fear etched into every expression. They were trapped in a nightmare, surrounded by the eerie mist that seemed to swallow everything whole. The rumbling from beneath the ship continued, vibrating through the hull, and the scraping noise, once distant, now felt like it was coming from deep within the ship's structure. It was as if something immense was alive beneath them, waiting for the moment to surface. Miller's heart raced as he stared ahead, the ghost ship growing ever larger in the mist. The figures on the deck of the ship stood still, watching them as they approached, their forms vague and indistinct, like shadows, but their glowing eyes were unmistakable. The more he looked, the more he could feel their presence, cold, ancient, unblinking. They were not just figures in the fog. They were something more. They were the guardians of the ship, the keepers of whatever lay trapped inside. Miller's voice broke the silence. "Sarah, do you have any idea what is happening?" Dunlop, her face pale with exhaustion, turned toward him. "I do not know, Captain. Whatever it is pulling us toward it. The ship, the Seawolf, is caught. We cannot fight it. We are at the mercy of whatever is controlling this." Miller clenched his jaw, his mind racing. There had to be something they could do. They were not helpless. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized they were no longer in control. Whatever force was pulling them, whatever ancient presence was guiding them, was far beyond human comprehension. This was not just a malfunction. This was something deliberate, something that had been set in motion long before they had arrived. The rumbling below grew louder, shaking the ship's frame with every passing second. The scraping noise intensified, as if something was dragging along the hull of the ship, inch by inch. It was an agonizing sound, one that filled the air with dread, a feeling of impending doom. The crew, now gathered on deck, stood frozen in place, unable to move as the tension mounted. They could feel it too. The ship was alive, and it was being controlled by something from within the depths. Miller turned back to the helm, staring into the fog. The ghost ship was now so close that he could see the rusted metal, the tattered sails fluttering in the wind. It seemed so real, so tangible, but it was as though it did not belong to this world. It was ancient, a relic from a time long forgotten. The ship moved with a grace that defied its appearance, gliding silently through the water, a silent predator in the mist. And then, the ship spoke, not in words, but in the same deep, vibrating hum that had been coming from beneath them. The sound filled the air, reverberating through their bones, as though the ship itself was trying to communicate. It was not a voice, they could not understand it, but it was a message. A warning. Something was coming. The air grew colder, and the fog pressed in tighter. Miller stepped back from the wheel, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the ship pulling them closer, unable to stop the inevitable. The ghost ship was mere feet away now, and the figures on the deck were now moving. They stepped forward, gliding silently, as if they had no need for solid ground. Dunlop's voice broke through the growing panic. "Captain, they are coming closer. We need to get off this ship. Now." Miller looked at her, his mind clouded with a mixture of fear and determination. "We cannot leave. The Seawolf is trapped here. We have to find out what this is." The crew stood in stunned silence as the figures continued their slow approach. They were close now, so close that the crew could see their faces. They were pale, ghostly, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The figures moved without speaking, their movements fluid, as though they were not bound by the laws of the physical world. There was no mistaking it now. These were spirits, and they were not here by chance. They were here because the ship had brought them. Miller felt a wave of cold wash over him as one of the figures, the tallest of them all, raised a hand toward him. He froze, his heart racing, as the figure's hand moved slowly, deliberately, until it pointed directly at him. The gesture was not threatening, it was not an attack, but it was a summons. It was as if the figure was calling him, pulling him towards something that he could not yet understand. The crew watched in horror as the ship groaned again, louder this time, as if responding to the figure's command. The fog parted just enough to reveal the dark, murky waters below, and that was when Miller saw it. Something massive, something enormous, moving just beneath the surface. He could barely make out the shape, but he knew it was not natural. It was a creature, something that had been waiting in the depths, waiting for the right moment to rise. "Captain, we need to move, now." Dunlop shouted again, her voice trembling. But it was too late. The Seawolf was already being pulled in, dragged by the unseen force beneath the ocean. The crew was helpless as the ghost ship loomed over them, its presence overwhelming, consuming everything in its path. What is the massive creature beneath the ocean? What do the spirits want from the crew of the Seawolf? The ship was being drawn in, and Captain James R. Miller could feel it with every fiber of his being. The fog had grown heavier, the air colder, and the ship seemed to vibrate with the unnatural force pulling them deeper into the heart of the mist. The massive ghost ship loomed close, its dark silhouette growing larger and more imposing. The figures on its deck had stopped moving, but their eyes were still fixed on the crew of the Seawolf. Their presence was suffocating, as if they were watching not just the crew, but the ship itself, waiting for something. Miller stood motionless at the helm, his hands gripping the wheel as if trying to hold the Seawolf in place. But he knew it was futile. The ship was no longer under his control. The engines were dead, the crew was scattered, and the pull from the ghost ship and the depths below seemed to be growing stronger with every passing moment. The scraping sound from beneath the ship had returned, louder now, a relentless, grinding noise that made Miller's skin crawl. It was as if something immense, something ancient, was moving just below them, circling the Seawolf like a predator preparing to strike. Lieutenant Sarah Dunlop was by his side, her face drawn and pale. She had been silent for a while, trying to make sense of the chaos unfolding around them, but now her voice was filled with urgency. "Captain, we cannot stay here. We have to move. We have to try something." Miller did not respond. He was too focused on the figures on the ghost ship, the spirits whose eyes were locked onto him, as though they were waiting for him to make the first move. He could feel the weight of their gaze, cold and unblinking. It was as if they knew something he did not, something he was about to learn, whether he was ready for it or not. Dunlop grabbed his arm, pulling him from his thoughts. "Captain, please, we need to act. Whatever is out there, it is not letting us go." Miller turned to her, his face hard with determination. "I know, Sarah. But what are we supposed to do? The ship is not moving. The fog is choking us. We are stuck here." He stepped away from the helm and looked out at the ghost ship. The figures were now standing still, their pale faces expressionless, their eyes glowing faintly. They did not speak, did not make a sound. They just stared, and the more Miller looked at them, the more he felt as if they were pulling him toward them, toward the ghost ship. It was as though they were trying to communicate, but their presence alone was enough to make his stomach churn with dread. "Captain," Dunlop said quietly, the scraping sound. "It is getting worse. It is coming from below us. I do not know what it is, but it is not just the ghost ship. Something else is down there." Miller nodded slowly, his eyes still locked on the ghost ship. The growling, rumbling sound from beneath the ship had intensified, now accompanied by the scraping. It was louder than ever before, vibrating through the ship's hull like a powerful current, as if something from the depths of the ocean was stirring, moving toward them. Suddenly, the ship gave a violent shudder, the entire vessel groaning under the strain. The lights flickered, then went out, plunging them into darkness. The fog pressed in even tighter, wrapping around them like a living thing. The scraping grew louder, more intense, and Miller's heart pounded in his chest. The ship was no longer just a vessel, it had become part of the force that surrounded them. It was as though the Seawolf itself was being pulled into the depths, into something far beyond their comprehension. "Captain!" Dunlop shouted, her voice tinged with panic. "The water, it is rising. We are sinking." Miller turned to her, his eyes wide with shock. He had not noticed the change until now, but the water had begun to rise around the ship, creeping up the sides of the hull. The crew was already scrambling to secure anything they could, but it was clear that they were running out of time. The ship was sinking, slowly, but steadily. The scraping grew louder, the growling from below vibrating through the entire ship. Miller could feel the pressure mounting, as if the very ocean was pressing down on them. Something was coming. Something was about to break through. The figures on the ghost ship moved again, their bodies shifting in the fog. Miller stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest, trying to make sense of what was happening. The fog had thickened so much that he could barely see the crew on deck. The ghost ship had moved closer, and now it was almost directly next to them. The crew was silent, paralyzed with fear, staring at the ghost ship, waiting for what would come next. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, something emerged from the water, a massive shape, enormous and powerful, rising slowly from beneath the Seawolf. The water roiled as the creature made its way toward the ship, its dark form emerging from the depths like an ancient leviathan. It was vast, its eyes glowing faintly, its massive body moving with an unsettling grace. The scraping sound intensified as the creature neared, its scales scraping against the hull of the ship. Miller could not take his eyes off the creature. It was alive, breathing, its presence overwhelming. The Seawolf had been pulled into its domain, trapped by something ancient, something that had been waiting beneath the ocean's surface. And now it was rising, emerging from the depths to claim them all. What is the creature that has emerged from the depths? What does it want with the Seawolf and its crew? The creature from the depths had fully emerged from beneath the Seawolf, its massive form rising like an ancient beast, its dark body shimmering with a faint, eerie glow. The ship groaned under the weight of the unseen force pulling it down, its hull scraping against the vast, unseen entity beneath the waves. Captain James R. Miller stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind racing to comprehend what was happening. The rumbling from below intensified, vibrating through the entire ship, and the scraping noise was now deafening. The water continued to rise around the ship, creeping up the sides of the hull, pushing the Seawolf into an uncontrollable descent. The crew was paralyzed, standing in shock as the creature's massive form loomed over them. There was no time to think, no time to plan. The Seawolf was sinking, and they were trapped in the grip of an ancient power that had been awakened from the depths. Miller turned to Dunlop, his eyes wide with fear. "We have to leave the ship. Now. There is no saving it." Dunlop did not hesitate. She had already begun shouting orders, trying to rally the crew, but the panic was palpable. No one knew what to do, no one knew how to escape. The fog was thick, blinding, and the ship was now tilted at a dangerous angle. The massive creature, its form still emerging from the water, seemed to tower over the ship, casting a shadow that stretched across the deck. Its eyes glowed, a faint, unnatural light that seemed to pierce through the fog and straight into Miller's soul. The ship continued to sink, the water now reaching the lower decks. Miller's thoughts raced as he turned to the crew, their faces painted with fear. There was no way out through the lower decks, they were flooding fast. The lifeboats were useless. The Seawolf was sinking too quickly. The creature from the depths had them cornered, and the fog seemed to grow thicker with each passing moment. They were trapped. Miller's mind snapped into focus. There had to be a way. He grabbed Dunlop by the arm, pulling her toward the bridge. "We need to get to the controls. We need to try to restart the engines. It is our only chance." But as they ran toward the bridge, the sound of a massive crash echoed behind them. The water had broken through the lower decks, flooding the corridors. The ship was sinking faster now, as if the creature had somehow become the weight of the ocean itself, dragging them into its depths. Miller could feel it, the force of the water rising, the pressure mounting, and in the distance, he heard the wail of the wind, the last sign of the Seawolf's final breath. "We cannot stop it," Dunlop said, her voice shaking as she looked at Miller. "We need to abandon ship. Now." But Miller did not stop. He pushed forward, his determination stronger than ever. They had to try. He had to try. The Seawolf had been their home for weeks, and now it was sinking, giving in to the force of the creature below. He reached the bridge and worked feverishly at the controls, trying everything to restart the engines. Nothing worked. The systems were completely fried. Miller's hand slammed against the console in frustration. He could hear the others screaming from below deck as the water continued to rise. He had failed them. But then, something inside him clicked. There was no time to think. There was no time to second-guess himself. He turned to Dunlop, his voice steady, even though his heart was racing. "We abandon ship. We get to the lifeboats, and we go. Now." The two of them turned and rushed back to the deck, where the lifeboats remained, barely visible through the fog. The water was now halfway up the ship, and the creature below them was still rising, its enormous body moving in slow, deliberate motions, as if it was savoring the destruction. The ghost ship had disappeared into the mist, its purpose fulfilled. Now, it was just Miller, Dunlop, and the remaining crew, all running for their lives. Miller and Dunlop reached the lifeboats first. They had no time to lose. They cut the ropes, and with a few others, they lowered the lifeboats into the water. The crew scrambled aboard, but Miller knew that not everyone would make it. There were too many of them, too much chaos, too little time. The fog, now thick as smoke, covered everything around them, but the creature's presence remained, a constant hum in the air, a reminder of what lay below. Miller looked out at the sinking Seawolf, now barely visible in the mist, its lights flickering one last time before disappearing beneath the waves. The ghost ship, the creature, it had all been part of something larger, something beyond their understanding. It had been waiting for them, and now, as the lifeboat drifted away, Miller understood that they had been caught in something ancient. Something that had been watching, waiting, for this moment. The lifeboat bobbed on the water, and for the first time in hours, the crew was silent. They did not speak of what had happened, of the creature, of the ship. They simply sat, exhausted, staring into the fog that now enveloped them. Miller's eyes stayed on the mist, but his mind was elsewhere. He had survived. He had led them out of the disaster. But at what cost? What had they truly escaped? What happens to the remaining crew members? What is the true nature of the creature that dragged the Seawolf down? The lifeboat drifted silently in the fog, the crew exhausted, every one of them still trying to comprehend what had just happened. The Seawolf was now gone, swallowed by the depths, its rusted hull lost to the ocean's mercy. The ghost ship, the creature from the depths, and the eerie fog, they were all now behind them, fading into the darkness. But the horror of what had occurred lingered, settling deep into their bones. For a moment, the crew remained silent, the only sound being the occasional splash of water as the boat bobbed on the surface. The distant hum of the creature could still be heard, but it was faint now, as if it was retreating back into the abyss. Captain James R. Miller sat at the front of the lifeboat, his eyes scanning the fog, his mind racing. He had survived. The others had survived. But the cost had been high. The crew that had once been so full of hope, so eager to finish their mission, was now reduced to a handful of survivors. And they had no answers, only questions that they would never get the chance to ask. Miller's thoughts drifted back to the ghost ship, the spirits on its deck, the ancient, massive creature that had pulled them under. They were no longer part of the living world. They had crossed into something far older, something beyond human comprehension. The creature, it seemed, had been a guardian, a keeper of the depths, watching over the ship for centuries. The Seawolf had been drawn into its web, caught in the grip of an ancient force that had been waiting for the right moment to awaken. And now, it was gone. The spirits had fulfilled their purpose, and the creature had returned to its resting place, deep beneath the ocean. As the fog began to lift, Miller saw the first signs of dawn breaking on the horizon. The crew was exhausted, and no one spoke, but their faces told the story. They had survived, but at what cost? They had witnessed things no one should ever see, and yet they were the ones left to tell the tale. They had been part of something far beyond them, something that had been waiting in the depths of the ocean, hidden from the world for centuries. Miller turned to Dunlop, who sat beside him in the lifeboat. She was staring out at the horizon, her face solemn. He could see the weight of the experience in her eyes. "We made it," he said quietly. Dunlop nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "But at what cost, Captain? What was that thing? What was that ship? It's as if we were never meant to survive." Miller did not have an answer. He had been in charge of the crew, had led them through the nightmare, but the truth of it all was still beyond him. The creatures, the spirits, the ship, it was all part of something larger, something that was not meant for human eyes to see. It had been a warning, and they had been the ones to answer it. As the boat drifted away from the sinking Seawolf, Miller felt a weight lift from his chest. The storm had passed, the fog was clearing, and the open ocean stretched before them. The Seawolf had gone down, and the ghost ship had returned to the depths, its secrets lost to the ocean. But the survivors, those who had been through it, would carry the weight of this experience for the rest of their lives. They had witnessed something beyond comprehension, and they would never forget it. The boat continued to drift, slowly moving toward the distant horizon, the faint light of the sun rising above them. For the first time since the events had started, Miller allowed himself a breath of relief. They had made it out. They had survived, but as they sailed forward into the open ocean, Miller knew one thing for certain: the world would never be the same again. The deep ocean held secrets no one could ever understand. And whatever had pulled the Seawolf into the fog was still out there, waiting, hidden beneath the waves. This was the final chapter of the journey, a terrifying and haunting adventure that no one would ever forget. If you have watched this story till the end, if you are still wondering what truly lies beneath the ocean, then this story deserves your precious like and subscribe. It is your support that allows me to bring you the next tale. Let me know where you are watching from. Your comments and support mean everything. Stay tuned for the next story.